At dawn on Friday, October 13, 1307, soldiers across the entire Kingdom of France broke down the same doors at the same hour, acting on sealed orders that had been distributed weeks earlier and forbidden to be opened until that exact morning. In a single coordinated strike, King Philip IV of France arrested every Knight Templar he could find, roughly 2,000 men in Paris alone, including the order's Grand Master. They marched into the Paris Temple, the Templars' fortified headquarters, and the single wealthiest bank in medieval Europe, expecting to seize a fortune. The treasury was empty. And in the harbor at La Rochelle, according to accounts that would circulate for centuries afterward, 18 Templar ships had slipped out to sea the night before, loaded with cargo, bound for a destination nobody has ever confirmed. 700 years later, historians, treasure hunters, and entire television series are still trying to answer the same two questions. Where did the money go, and who warned them it was coming? This is the undertold, and some mysteries refuse to die. If this is your first time here, subscribe. We dig up buried history every week. To understand why anyone believed the Templars had a fortune worth this kind of secrecy, you have to understand what the order actually was. Founded in 1119 to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem after the First Crusade, the Knights Templar grew, within less than 2 centuries, into something closer to a multinational corporation than a monastic brotherhood. They built an early version of international banking. A pilgrim could deposit funds at a Templar house in London and withdraw the equivalent in Jerusalem using a coded letter of credit, without ever carrying gold across bandit-infested roads. They owned farmland, vineyards, castles, and entire towns across Europe and the Holy Land. They lent money to kings. By the early 1300s, the Templars answered to no king and no local bishop, only to the Pope himself, which made them fantastically wealthy, functionally untouchable under normal law, and, to at least one increasingly desperate monarch, a problem that needed solving. That monarch was Philip IV of France, and by 1307, his kingdom's finances were in genuine crisis. Years of war with England and the Flemish had drained the royal treasury, and Philip had already resorted to debasing the currency and expelling France's Jewish population, specifically to seize their assets. The Templars represented his single largest creditor. The crown owed them enormous, well-documented sums. And unlike the Jewish community he had already targeted, the Templars were protected directly by papal authority. Philip needed a justification serious enough to override that protection. And in the summer of 1307, he found one. Confessions, extracted under interrogation, from a disgruntled former Templar, alleging heresy, idol worship, and secret initiation rituals involving spitting on the cross. Modern historians largely regard these charges as fabricated or wildly exaggerated. At the time, they were exactly what Philip needed. The arrests themselves were a masterpiece of medieval logistics. Philip's ministers drafted secret warrants months in advance and distributed them to royal officials across France under strict instruction. Do not open these documents until the appointed date. That level of coordinated secrecy, across an entire kingdom, in an age with no telegraph, no printing press, and no standing national police force, is itself remarkable. And it is the reason historians take seriously the idea that some Templars somewhere might have received a warning through informal channels the official record never captured. When the sealed orders were finally opened simultaneously across France on the morning of October 13th, they described the charges, authorized the arrests, and instructed officials to seize all Templar property and hold every knight for interrogation. It worked almost everywhere, almost instantly, and almost completely. The operative word being almost. What followed for the arrested knights was brutal. Prisoners, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were transferred to sites like the Tower of Chinon and subjected to torture methods standard for heresy interrogations of the era. And under that pressure, the vast majority confessed to exactly the charges Philip's investigators wanted confirmed. De Molay himself confessed, then later publicly recanted, insisting the confession had been extracted through torture and was false. That reversal would eventually cost him his life. But amid all the coerced confessions about secret rituals and idol worship, one thing conspicuously does not appear anywhere in the surviving interrogation records. A single word about where the order's movable wealth, its coin, its precious objects, its most portable and valuable assets, had actually gone. The men being tortured for confessions of heresy were apparently never asked or never able to answer, the one question later generations would care about most. When royal officials searched the Paris temple itself, the order's central stronghold and treasury, they found the building, its records, and its most valuable contents already gone, or unaccounted for. Exactly how much wealth was actually stored there on any given day is debated. A functioning international bank does not necessarily keep its full assets sitting in a vault, since much of the Templars' actual wealth existed as land, debts owed to them, and financial instruments rather than physical gold. But the specific absence of a fortune contemporaries clearly expected to find, combined with the timing, is exactly what launched 7 centuries of speculation. Either the Templars' famous wealth was never the mountain of physical treasure popular imagination assumes, or someone moved it before the soldiers arrived and did so cleanly enough to leave no trace in any surviving French royal record. This is where the story of the vanishing fleet enters, and it deserves to be examined carefully, because the popular version and the historical evidence do not fully agree. According to accounts that circulated for centuries after the arrests, 18 Templar ships departed the port of La Rochelle on the night of October 12th, hours before the arrests began at dawn, loaded with treasure and sailing toward an unknown destination, never to be officially accounted for again. It is a genuinely dramatic image, and it has anchored countless books, documentaries, and treasure hunting expeditions. It is also, according to most professional historians studying primary French and Templar records, more legend than confirmed fact. There is limited direct primary source documentation proving 18 specific ships loaded with treasure departed La Rochelle on that exact night. And some scholars argue the story developed and grew in the retelling over subsequent centuries, rather than originating in a contemporary eyewitness account. Whether or not that specific midnight departure happened exactly as legend describes, the broader claim beneath it, that at least some Templars and some Templar assets escaped Philip's net, is much better supported. The order's suppression was never total or instant everywhere in Europe. In Portugal, King Dinis simply refused to persecute the Templars the way Philip demanded, and in 1319 formally reorganized the Portuguese Templars into a new chivalric order, the Order of Christ, which absorbed their properties, their fortresses, and, historians widely agree, at least a meaningful portion of their wealth intact. In Scotland, a nation under papal excommunication at the time, due to Robert the Bruce's own conflicts with Rome, the Pope's arrest bull technically had no local authority to enforce, meaning Templars who reached Scottish shores may have found genuine practical sanctuary, protected less by legend than by a very real gap in papal jurisdiction. Some fortune, in other words, almost certainly did escape. The dramatic version is the part that's unproven. The underlying claim is not. 700 years, a burned Grand Master, an empty treasury, and a fleet that either vanished into legend or simply sailed home. And we are only at the halfway point. Tell me in the comments, do you think the 18 ships are real history or romantic legend? I read everyone. And if you want the version of this story that separates the documented history from the treasure hunting mythology built on top of it, subscribe. Because the next part is where this mystery splits into the legends everyone has heard, and the actual evidence almost nobody checks. Jacques de Molay spent nearly 7 years imprisoned after his arrest. his fate tied up in a slow-moving struggle between King Philip and Pope Clement V, who had reluctantly gone along with the suppression of the order in 1312, but resisted for years, condemning de Molay personally to death. That resistance finally collapsed in March 1314. Brought before a public tribunal in Paris to formally confirm his earlier confession one final time, de Molay instead reversed himself completely, publicly declaring the charges false and the confession a product of torture. Philip, furious at the public reversal, had de Molay and a fellow Templar leader burned at the stake that same day on an island in the Seine without further trial. It was, even by the standards of the era, an unusually swift and irregular execution, which is exactly the kind of detail that tends to grow into legend. According to a story that began circulating not long after his death, Jacques de Molay, as the flames rose around him, cursed both King Philip IV and Pope Clement V, declaring that both men would be summoned before God's judgment within the year. Clement V died just 1 month later. Philip IV died 8 months after that, at only 46 years old. In a hunting accident, historians still find somewhat unusual for a man that age. Whether or not de Molay actually said anything of the kind in his final moments, no contemporary trial transcript records it, and the earliest surviving version of the curse story dates from years after the fact. The timing of two very powerful men's deaths, arriving almost exactly as promised, is precisely the kind of coincidence history refuses to let go of. It's worth addressing directly the most elaborate treasure legend connected to the Templars, because it has shaped decades of popular fiction. The claim that a small French town called Rennes-le-Chateau sits atop a hidden Templar fortune, protected by a secret society called the Priory of Sion, tracing back centuries, guarding secrets about the Holy Grail and the bloodline of Christ. This version of the story exploded in popularity through 1980s bestsellers and later blockbuster fiction. It has also been definitively and repeatedly debunked by historians and journalists, who traced its origin to a set of documents called the Dossier Secrets, deposited in the French National Library in the 1960s and later proven to be an elaborate 20th century forgery created by a con artist named Pierre Plantard. The Rennes-le-Chateau legend is not an old Templar secret. It is a hoax roughly 60 years old, dressed up to look 700. A more historically grounded theory involves Rosslyn Chapel, a 15th century chapel outside Edinburgh built by the Sinclair family, whose ancestors had documented verifiable connections to the Knights Templar and to Scotland's broader medieval nobility. The chapel's interior is covered in dense, unusual stone carvings, including botanical designs some researchers claim resemble New World corn and aloe plants, species that should not have been known in Europe decades before Columbus's voyages, if the carvings genuinely date to the chapel's construction. Mainstream historians remain skeptical of that specific botanical claim and note the carvings are open to multiple interpretations. But the underlying Sinclair Templar family connection itself is real, documented genealogy, not legend, which is part of why Rosslyn keeps drawing serious researchers back, even when the most sensational claims about it don't hold up. Then there is Oak Island, off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada, where treasure hunters have been digging into a mysterious depression called the Money Pit since 1795. Over 2 centuries of excavation that has consumed millions of dollars and, in several documented accidents, lives. Templar theory advocates point to genuine physical finds recovered from the island. A medieval stone cross uncovered in 2017, dated to a range consistent with the 1300s, bearing similarities to crosses carved by imprisoned Templars in Dôme, France. And a lead artifact whose material composition testing pointed to origins in southern France dating to the 1300s or 1400s. These are real laboratory results, not fabricated claims. What they do not do is prove a Templar treasure is actually buried on Oak Island. A medieval French artifact could have arrived on that coastline through any number of later European expeditions with no Templar connection at all, and after more than 200 years of digging, no organized treasure chamber, no coordinated hoard has ever actually been found. So where does that leave the actual historical picture, stripped of the Grail legends and buried chest fantasies? Most professional historians studying the Order's suppression agree on something less cinematic, but arguably more interesting. The Templars' true wealth was never a single hoard waiting to be dug up. It was a decentralized network of landholdings, debts owed to the Order, and financial instruments spread across dozens of countries. And when the Order collapsed, that wealth didn't vanish so much as it dispersed, absorbed into the Hospitallers, who received much of the Order's confiscated European property by formal papal decree in 1312, reorganized into Portugal's Order of Christ, or simply quietly retained by local nobility and Templar members who managed, one way or another, to keep what they already held. There was no single missing chest. There were thousands of small, undramatic transfers of land and coin that the legend of a hidden treasure has spent 700 years trying to compress into one satisfying, findable secret. Maybe that's the actual reason this story refuses to die. Not because the treasure is still hidden somewhere waiting for the right map, but because the true answer, bureaucratic, distributed, scattered across 3 centuries of property transfers and quiet arrangements between medieval institutions, has never been dramatic enough to compete with 18 ships vanishing into the night. Jacques de Molay's ashes went into the Seine in 1314. Whatever the Templars actually owned went into ledgers, land deeds, and the treasuries of the orders and nobles who absorbed them. One unglamorous transaction at a time. And somewhere between those two facts, in the gap where a genuinely dramatic mystery meets a genuinely undramatic explanation, 700 years of treasure hunters have kept digging anyway. Some mysteries refuse to die,